Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. This is the Falsifiable Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Denton. My guest today is Richard Landes. Richard is a medievalist and historian of apocalyptic movements. He currently resides in Jerusalem. His new book, which was published in 2022, is called Can the Whole World Be Wrong? And I have almost finished the book. I sadly did not finish the entire thing, but I got most of the gist of it, which is it's a fantastic book, and I can tell that you spend a lot of time on it. The notes are extensive and everything else. But anyway, so how are you doing, Richard?
I'm all right. I had a friend who I showed him the book and he sort of flipped through the pages and said, "Oh, 500 pages of yes."
Yeah, yeah. That's my response to it as well. Okay, so today I wanted to start though with we were going to talk about the pattern, which is this idea that David Deutsch presented. And first of all, what is the pattern with a capital P?
Okay, so the pattern as he describes it is it's interesting because as a physicist, it's like he detected something that isn't clearly visible, but is a sort of underlying force. And that is what he calls the necessity of uh, the necessity of the justification of hurting Jews. In other
Mm,
words, it's it has to be okay to hurt Jews. You don't have to do it. You don't have to even want it to happen, but somehow writers are continually compelled to take positions and make statements that legitimize hurting Jews.
mm,
And I think that, in terms of the book I did on the role of the media, you have a whole bunch of journalists who, in many cases, are Jewish and in many cases are sympathetic to Israel, and yet they feel compelled to report these lethal narratives from the Palestinians without checking them. And here I'm thinking of people like Jake Tapper and Wolf Blitzer on CNN,
mm,
who are repeatedly sort of find themselves in a position of affirming the pattern without even realizing that that's what they're doing. So the
mm,
pattern is it's an unconscious pattern, but he argues that it is literally a constant.
mm. When did it start? Does he have y'all pinned that down or?
Yeah, so he relates it back to even before Christianity, and there are certainly some Christian writers, some pre-Christian writers, including Tacitus and Appian in the ancient world,
Mm,
um, who were sort of very vigorous proponents of these attitudes towards Jews that made hurting them legitimate.
mm,
He thinks it's literally a constant of Jewish history, and in one sense, you might even link it to that really strange remark that God makes to Abraham: "Those who bless you, I will bless; those who curse you, I will curse." That there's somehow some compulsion to curse the Jews.
mm. Yeah, that's it's weird and it's funny that David Deutsch puts this forward. I came across you actually. Let me just put this out there by reading Deutsch, and then I followed him on Twitter, and I think I'd seen him. He is a extreme, a defender of Israel at constantly defending Israel, which I found great. And but he actually persuaded me in many ways of what he called the pattern. But then I think I'd asked him about a book to read as far as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict
Right?
is, and he recommended talking to you actually. And I think I tweeted you. This was like probably a year ago, and you told me about a book called The
Right.
War of Return, I believe. And I read
Yes.
that, and What's funny is I'm a person that I just hadn't paid attention to really much of this until October 7th, whenever all of this started coming out, and you just see
Right.
a bunch of irrationality around it. And but yeah, so I read that book, and I just noticed all of these things where it's like, why is Israel being blamed for everything whenever they're just defending themselves? And then if you try to, people that criticize it say that they're just criticizing Israel. There is some sort of tacit underlying with a lot of it, which is they're criticizing Jews in a way. And do you see? Actually, let me take this example. So I watched Piers Morgan, which he had a lot of people on his show after that happened, talking
Right.
about this. And this is the first time I was introduced to Norman Finkelstein was on his
Oh,
show. And
right.
I wanted to hear a comment from you about this, which is this is what Norman Finkelstein posted on Substack after the October 7th attack. And it says, for the past 20 years, the people of Gaza, half of whom are children, have been immured in a concentration camp. Today, they breach the camp's walls. If we honor John Brown's armed resistance to slavery, if we honor the Jews who revolted in the Warsaw Ghetto, the moral consistency commands that we honor the heroic resistance in Gaza. I, for one, will never begrudge. On the contrary, it warms every fiber of my soul the scenes of Gaza's smiling children as their arrogant Jewish supremacist oppressors finally have been humbled. The stars above in heaven are looking kindly down. Glory, glory, hallelujah, the souls of Gaza go marching on. What is your response to something like that?
Well, it's pathological.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, it's like,
Mm,
one of the interesting aspects of it is this image of Gaza as an open air prison or concentration camp, and unbearable. The fact is that the pictures that were coming out of Gaza from Gazans who were, in families that were well off, which meant largely families that were high in the Hamas hierarchy, were pictures of, shopping malls and swimming pools, and it looked fine. And ironically, today one of the memes that Gazans are putting out there to blame Israel is pictures of what it was like before October 7th and after. So before, it's all these pictures of, you know refrigerators filled and stores filled with food and all kinds of good things, and now it's terrible, and now the Israelis, and so they forgot that they were saying that this place was a disaster.
a
Now,
prison.
right, right, and Norman Finkelstein just gobbles it up and considers the situation in Gaza to be similar to the situation in the Warsaw Ghetto, where people were literally being starved to death and then rounded up and sent off to death camps, which
Mm.
is not what was going on and still isn't what's going on in Gaza. So there's a kind of, I think one of the things that Deutsch points out, and I agree entirely with this, is that it's not just Gentiles who were driven, not just non Jews who were driven to legitimize hurting Jews. Jews themselves feel driven by this. And so you have people like Norman Finkelstein, you have people like Gidon Levy, and Amos Shokin, who is the editor of Haaretz newspaper, which
Mm.
is barely read by Israelis because it's so disgusting and just gobbled up by the Western press because it's in English, it's highbrow, and it is ferociously anti-Israel.
Mm.
So, I mean, Finkelstein is a peculiar case. I've heard him. I've spoken with him. It turns out we were both at Princeton together as graduate students, but in different fields. But but he really is. Um, he's driven. There's a hysterical piece where he is debating. I forget who was the the moderator, but he was debating somebody over whether there's a double standard about Israel.
Mm.
Now, there's just no question that there's a
Right.
double standard about Israel, but he was in total denial of it. And
Mm.
his arguments were just bizarre. And then when it became clear that he was going to lose this argument, he threw a fit, accused everybody of being idiots, and hung up.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so so this is he's a perfect example of the sort of, what are they called? When silo. He's a perfect example of a silo, or a bubble in
Mm.
which he only works when people want to hear what he has to say, and as soon as he's confronted by somebody else, he can't hold his own.
Right. Yeah, I would like to see him in conversation with somebody like Douglas Murray. That would be an interesting interaction, which I've never seen.
Well, I
So,
think actually there may be a case, I don't know, but it's possible that they met on who was the guy you mentioned
oh,
before?
actually, you know what? It's funny. It was that episode. They didn't meet,
Piers
but
Morgan.
yeah, Douglas Murray came on after and called him.
Right,
Basically, said that he was disreputable, and
right, right. And
and
he is, and
yeah,
he is,
exactly, yeah.
and bizarrely, he's taken seriously by people like, and this really shocked me. Glenn Lowry had him
Mm,
on and praised his scholarship, which is pathetic. His scholarship is pathetic, um, but as we know in our day and age, um, people want to believe what they want to believe, and there's apparently a deep need to feel that it's legitimate to hurt Jews. And he is a perfect example of sort of an extreme case of Deutsches pattern.
right. Yeah, and just to drill down on him for a minute, or just this psyche. In that case, do you think, because it is extremely bizarre, the things that come out of him and also people like Noam Chomsky, do you think that they drill into this because of its popularity that it brings them? Or do you think that because they come off as like, they want to be presented as
Yeah,
these academics that are like, the
right,
most, well-founded academics that are out there, but it has to be some sort of audience capture with them, I would think, where it's like they're uh,
right,
pandering to some sort of audience that they've got. I don't know. It's just so bizarre they would continue this path.
right.
It's really weird.
So I I see three elements involved. And I think I talk about it in the book. I talk about what I call masochistic omnipotence syndrome,
Mm,
which
yes.
is this belief that it's all our fault. And so if we could fix ourselves, we could fix everything.
Mm,
So it's a kind of messianic belief that turns in on itself. And in my book on millennialism, my first case study is the study of um, the the Xhosa cattle slayers in South Africa
mm,
in 1856, who, this woman, this teenager, female teenager, told them to kill all their cattle, and then the ancestors would return with healthy cattle and so on. There was cattle disease at the time, and they did, and they all starved to death.
mm,
So there is a kind of suicidal dimension to some messianic beliefs, and I think that that's one of the things driving them, and that connects to what you might call the virtue signaling of, look at me, I'm self-critical.
mm,
Look at me, I'm not one of those tribal Jews who defends Israel right or wrong, but they end up falling into the opposite, which is attacking Israel, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. And then I think you're right. There is an audience, and I think even more than Finkelstein, who's something my sense is that he's a very lonely guy,
right.
and he doesn't really have. It's not like he's popular. In fact, he at one point denounced BDS as a cult.
Mm,
Um, so he's a strange guy.
mm,
But I think it is true of somebody like what's his name, Peter. Uh, I'm getting to that point where I don't remember people's
Oh,
names.
that's okay.
Peter Beinart.
Oh, okay.
I
Yeah,
do
yeah.
think that Peter Beinart is hanging with the crowd, and he's important.
Mm.
And yeah, as a Jew willing to attack Israel, you're very popular amongst the people who want to attack Israel because you, as Gerald Steinberg says, you enable them to Jew wash their hatred.
Mm. Mm.
It's not me who's just. It's not just me. But look at these Jews, and Beinart is an observant Jew. He's an Orthodox Jew, so he can't be wrong. Yes, he
Mm.
can.
Can does it, and I'm going to circle back around to getting into the pattern, but right now I like to drill in on a couple things just for people
Okay.
to have some sound bites here because it's just fascinating. Can Is it harder to you to defend Israel at this point with what's going on in Gaza? Do you find it harder, or are you just as adamant as before? Or as far as like the death count and things like that, the disparity there between 1,200 Jews on October 7th versus whatever it is now, 43,
Right.
44,000? Do you feel the reason I'm asking this is because I defend this all the time online, and it's like people react to it like I'm a psychopath,
Right.
essentially.
Right. Right.
And do you find that? And does it play in your mind at all?
Yeah. No. I look. One of the real problems I see at work here is what a friend of mine, I think, coined a good term for it. He called it warnography,
Mm,
which is the porn of war and images of human suffering. And Hamas, in particular, the Palestinian leadership in general, have for the last 25 years successfully pumped their warnography into the Western public sphere and made it a kind of emotional blackmail where if
mm,
you're not sympathetic to the Palestinians, you're a terrible person. You have no compassion. How can you look at these images of suffering and not be moved by them? And what's striking about it is, first of all, being the person who coined the term Pallywood, a lot of this stuff is staged. Even the stuff that's real, in other words, there really is a dead baby, nonetheless, the baby is being paraded around. Or there's an injured girl. Instead of taking her to the hospital, she's being paraded around in front of the cameras, held by a young boy who's just taken her off a table that's behind him. So
mm,
this kind of stuff is aimed at coercing us into sympathy.
mm.
There was a tweet that just went up. I haven't responded to it yet, but I saw a tweet that's was about people who are saying my heart goes out to all the people in Los Angeles who have lost their home. And it was, oh yeah, well, what about the Palestinians? What about the Gazans?
Right.
Well, the Gazans didn't attack people and kill 1,000, kill hundreds of them, including civilians, sadistically.
Mm.
And the people in California don't have an army hiding underneath them and
Right.
attacking.
Right.
So there's just no comparison whatsoever, and yet there's this kind of I don't know. I'm sure that psychiatrists have a term for this, but there's this kind of obsessive self-centeredness in which my suffering trumps everything.
Hmm.
It trumps what my leaders have done. It trumps what I approve of. It
Hmm.
trumps any other issues. I mean, to be perfectly honest, 40,000 people dead, probably half of them being combatants,
Right.
is actually not a bad, for a year and a half intense urban warfare.
Yeah, in
This
that
is,
dense area. I mean, that's
yeah,
insane. Yeah.
and with Hamas hiding there. So you get CNN, which will do a piece, or recently the American Historical Association, which just passed, or at least a committee passed, a condemnation of Israel for scholasticide. And
Mm,
CNN will do a thing on how Israel is deliberately destroying the medical system in Gaza. And none of them mention the fact that this is where Hamas is hiding. This is where Hamas works from specifically so it will inhibit Israel from striking them. And when Israel does strike them, they can scream scholasticide and whatever else.
mm,
And so, I, I, I feel terrible for the Gazans who are suffering, but it certainly doesn't make me feel like, oh my gosh, this is indefensible behavior.
mm,
This is one of the tragedies of a Palestinian culture that for over a century has found the existence of autonomous Jews unbearable to their pride, unbearable to the honor of their religion.
mm. Yeah, I mean, can we just to drill down on that, talk about the all of the times that Israel there's been a proposed offering of a two-state solution, and
Right,
Israel's accepted several times, and then it's been
right,
rejected by the Palestinians. And for some reason, public intellectuals, generally on the far left, have amnesia about this, or they treat it
right.
as it was completely
Well,
unfair to begin with, even though some of these
right,
were extremely, they went very far in
right, right.
meeting the needs of the Palestinians.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd say it's not people on the far left. It's people at least who present themselves as in the center. And here I'm thinking in particular of, recently we've heard Bill Clinton talk about how betrayed he felt and how, he had such an amazing deal for Arafat, and Arafat said no. And a year after Arafat said no, a whole series of articles came out, including a key one in the New York Times by their chief correspondent there, Deborah Sontag,
Mm,
in which she basically said, Arafat was right to say no. It was a bunch of Bantustans, and it wasn't a real deal, and they were trying to coerce him, and he was right to say no. So you have, at least at that time, the New York Times has now revealed itself to be off the wall. But at the time, it was still the paper of record.
hmm
And you have the chief correspondent of the paper of record saying, no, Arafat's no at Camp David was not a terrible blow to the Palestinian people.
mm,
Which is again an example of Deutsch's pattern, which is the Intifada was legitimate, and Paul Berman has a really excellent remark about that, in which he says, people interpreted the viciousness of the terror, the suicide bombs in buses and restaurants and shopping malls, as a measure of the cruelty of the Israelis to the Palestinians,
mm,
which was a kind of projection of their mentality, which is to say, I would never do that unless people had been unbelievably horrendous to me. So the Palestinians would never do that unless the Israelis had been unbelievably horrible to them. And that's what, that quote you gave from Finkelstein illustrates.
right.
But the problem here is that, I mean, again, in my book, I go into what I call cognitive egocentrism. And for liberals, the cognitive egocentrism in which they project their mentality onto others cannot recognize what's happening, what's going on in Palestinian culture. And when you talk about that, you get accused of being a racist or an
Mm,
Islamophobe. But the fact is that, look, Islam never in its entire history has ever, shall we say, with the possibility of some of the Sufi orders, but even the Sufis ended up being major jihadis. Islam has never achieved any serious measure of the separation of mosque and state.
Mm,
So, so
right.
for them, the existence of an autonomous infidel state inside Dar al Islam, which should be the whole world, is absolutely unbearable. And the reason that they've said no over and over and over again has nothing to do with their concern for their people or their desire to create a Palestinian state, because I don't think there are any Palestinian leaders so far that we've seen who care about the Palestinian people. It's all about denying Israel autonomy. That's the unbearable reality. And there's
Mm,
an interesting prayer that Jews say when they say their blessings after their meal, which is, who broke the yoke, the merciful one who will break the yoke of um, the yoke of diaspora from off of our neck and bring us back upright into our land. And
mm,
it's that upright that gets up the nose of triumphalist, domineering Muslims, whether they're Palestinian or Egyptian or Syrian or go to Iran or Pakistan or wherever you want. The idea that Jews can stand upright is somehow unbearable. And again, we get to Deutsch's pattern, which is it has to be legitimate to hurt Jews because Jews have to be insecure. If
mm,
Jews can be secure, they're extremely dangerous.
right. That's uh it does it beg the thing about the pattern the it's interesting that Deutsch put this forward because of Deutsch like in 2013 I'd heard him speak and I was immediately enamored with his talk of science and I was already heavily into science but he got me on the path of becoming a Popperian, which I'm a huge advocate of Karl Popper now, and I sort of a disciple of this man at this point. But it's funny though because this pattern, Deutsch always talks about explanatory power, and things tend to. He's very foundationalist or anti-foundationalist in his epistemology, but um, this pattern is so interesting coming from him though because it is so ethereal. And I guess the question that I wonder about it is, why does it exist? Do you think?
Right. So he and I did a course together for ISCAP. And in the fourth session, I presented my theory, which is related to what we've been talking about, namely the issue of, um, let's call it shame honor culture.
Hmm.
I think that it is the one of the driving forces of shame honor culture. On the one hand, it's the desire for honor, and not only is there a desire, but there's a necessity to have honor in order to live. I mean, if you're in a shame honor culture and you don't have honor, then you're a non-person.
Mm,
So the terrible importance of gaining honor, keeping honor, and if your face has been blackened, restoring honor through shedding blood.
mm,
Or as one of my friends who studies the phenomenon says, um, blood is the bleach of honor. That's how
ooh,
you whiten your face after it's been darkened. And so, but the other part of it is this enormous fear of shame, of being shamed. And I think that there's an element here in uh, Jewish culture amongst the earliest cultures, I would say the earliest culture, to sort of pass up shame honor culture dynamics for what I call integrity guilt dynamics. And
Mm.
you can see it, for example, in the story of um, Judah and Tamar. I won't go into the details, but you can look it up. It's Genesis 38, and the end of the story is that he's about to do an honor killing. She's guilty in his mind of having shamed the family by behaving sexually inappropriately,
Mm.
um, and he's ready to burn her. And then when she sends him the evidence that he's the father, he says she's more righteous than I am. And that is really the first time in world literature that you have an alpha male renouncing an honor killing
Mm.
um, as a result of being self critical. So I think that the Jews, by and large, do not play these games. I mean, this doesn't mean that Jews don't like honor, there's nobody on earth who wants to be shamed. It's just that they won't turn to violence in order to restore what they feel they rightfully deserve. And I think that renunciation has been enormously influential in Jewish success. And I think that this is essentially the need for it to be legitimate to hurt Jews is a way of pulling Jews down.
Mm. Yeah, it's so bizarre, especially given that Jews are such a small minority on the planet. I mean, it's
Yeah,
very weird. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and and we were talking about this, and he said, "Why do you think that Jews are treated this way?" And it was kind of I felt like there was an implication there, like it could be that it's warranted in some way. And then
right.
I could sense th this pattern idea came up in my brain. I was like, I can feel it working in the background here. Like, why else would they be hated? I mean,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
they have to be up to something.
Can the
And
whole world be wrong?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And and then I was sent people I will have people send me things that of Jews doing things that are, you know, not good or maybe but I'm sitting here thinking, but wait a minute though. This is an incident that first of all, I have no context for this incident, whatever
Right,
it may have been. And this is one person doing one thing
right,
without context.
right,
I have no idea.
right,
And yet there's people all over the world doing countless terrible things. Why are we focusing so much attention
right.
on the Jews you know what I mean? It's so bizarre. And
Well, there's another explanation too, and that is that um, this is an argument that a number of people make, which is that Jews were the first to introduce morality,
oh,
ethical monotheism,
mm,
which called for a level of self restraint that no other, I mean, the Romans called for discipline, but not ethical discipline, military discipline. They had ethics and they had demands that they made, but nothing anywhere near the range of demands, in particular for self criticism, for being willing to be publicly accept criticism and to self criticize. Um, and as a result, um, people really resent them. And they resent them for two reasons. One, because they don't like the moral demands that ethical monotheism makes on the one hand, and on the other hand, they don't like the fact that the Jews, having accepted these demands, outperform other people remarkably. I mean, that's the joke about the Nobel Prize. We've got 20% of Nobel prizes, and we're 0.2% of the world population. I mean,
right.
it makes no sense. And there are readings of anti-Semitism or Jew hatred or resentment of Jews that argue that it's basically envy. It's
Mm,
it's on the one hand it's envy, but on the other hand it's an envy that doesn't isn't willing to put in the discipline and commitment that would enable people to perform at the same levels.
Mm,
So you get this really sad drive to hurt the Jews as a way of keeping them down,
mm,
and that's the way it's been. And you know, when you get to modern society, when you get to the democratic revolutions, the late 18th century in France and the United States, and subsequently in many countries in Europe, you have the Jews are in a sense emancipated and allowed to be citizens and to play by the same rules as everybody else. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't all sorts of sort of hidden ways in which they're kept down, but on the other hand, um, it is a it is a way in which um, Jews are able to compete on a relatively level playing field, and they do really well.
mm,
And
hmm.
that is really alarming. And then there's one more dimension, which is that historically Christians and Muslims have treated Jews quite badly. There are moments of tolerance, but there's a long record of treating Jews badly. If you listen to the complaints that the Palestinians make about how the Jews treat them, it's literally a description of how Muslims treated Jews for the last 1400 years.
Right.
Um, so, so on the one hand, you have this long history, and there seems to be a real fear that if Jews had power, they would take vengeance. And I think that's why you have this deep anxiety about Jews defending themselves. Nobody would blink, and nobody blinked in World War II when the West went after the Japanese and the Germans, and they went after them, citizens and all. You
Hmm.
know, somebody posted an interesting graphic showing a large bomb, which was the quantity of tons of what TNT that was dropped on Germany, and then an even bigger bomb that was dropped on on Japan, and then a huge bomb bigger than both of them put together that was dropped on Gaza. What they didn't say was that, you know, the bombs that were dropped on Germany and Japan killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese and Germans, and the massive number of bombs that the Israelis have dropped have, in comparison, barely killed people.
Mm,
But because we get these constant images of the suffering shoved in our face,
mm,
it makes this enormous impression. I mean, I think that if you were to interview the people at these camps, these encampments at the university protesting, you'd be looking at people whose Twitter feed and whose TikTok feed and whose social media feeds are constantly bombarding them with pictures of Palestinians suffering. How
mm.
can you not do something?
Right. Yeah. It's funny on this whole subject. I felt as if I had to read like 10 books before I could make any comments on it because I just wanted to be principled about the whole thing. But what's funny is I actually had a conversation with a guy, um, that it went into complete disaster mode because we got into a real kerfuffle over the Israel-Palestine thing because he was making claims that were just so outlandish, and he puts a lot of stuff online that's extremely anti-Israel from places like Middle Eastern Eye and like all of these.
Yeah,
I've looked
yeah,
them up, and it's just like, and then of course like Human Rights Watch and like Amnesty International and all these NGOs
right.
that seem to be complicit in something nefarious here. But like, um, the thing that I noticed though was that he wasn't caring about any facts. Like he was more caring about emotions. And
Yes,
the way that I know this is that he was saying things like, "Oh, we went into the only reason the United States cares is because of things like oil." And I was like, "Wait a minute though." Israel doesn't have any oil. I mean, they don't have,
Right.
it's not that sort of thing. And then I was just getting confronted like this with these, non-facts, and I can't argue with this because I'm like, listen, before we even sit down to have this talk, you're gonna have to, our epistemology is just so far
Right.
off
Right.
that we
Right.
can't meet like properly to even have this debate. And I'm saying all this because I've noticed this on these comment threads. You see some of the most ignorant comments, and some of it's just flat out stupid.
Well,
But
like the remark about oil. I mean, the
right,
reason
yeah.
why the reason why the Department and the British Foreign Service are filled with Arabists who dislike Israel and have for the last 100 years, well, I mean, let's call it the last 80 years, since 45. Um, the reason why is because of Arab oil. If
Mm.
anything, the oil is a reason to be anti-Israel, not to be pro-Israel.
Right. Yeah. It does exactly. And I guess my point is that there's just, again, it comes back to the pattern, which is there's just this need. It's a knee-jerk reaction rather, that people have whenever they hear anything that Israel's done. It could be the slightest like
Yeah,
retaliation to something that was perpetrated on them. And then,
right.
oh, actually, this leads me to I recently read Alan Dershowitz. I read two of his books, but I read The Case for Israel, which I thought was interesting, and then I read this other one. It's called Israel and Her Enemies, or something like that. And the subtitle is something about his basically him being critiquing Jimmy Carter and his
Right,
stance on Israel. And Jimmy Carter had written this book, Peace or Palestine, Israel, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, or something like that. And
right,
he has this
right,
in the title, this whole
right,
apartheid accusation.
right.
And anyways, Alan Dershowitz just makes all these amazing, or a really strong argument against all of this. And I just wanted to hear sort of you comment on perhaps, if you can, on Jimmy Carter. And it's weird because I actually admire Jimmy Carter in a lot of ways because
Right.
he has somewhat of a, with the Carter Center has a stellar record on certain things, but then this whole stance that he takes on Israel, and especially since he's a Christian, and he
Yeah,
comes from like the Baptists, it's very
right.
strange. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so there have been a number of pieces that have come out since his death, which outline the deep Christian hostility to Judaism that he expressed throughout his life, including in his classes, his Sunday school classes that he gave to children.
Mm,
Um, so that's one dimension. There's another dimension which is much more disturbing, and that is that Carter, at least among some of us, is famous for being a member of a group that called itself the Elders, which included Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and other sort of global progressive figures. And at one point in 2007, I think, they went to Darfur to examine the situation there. And people were saying that it was a genocide. And by any serious definition of genocide, it sure looked like one. And they came away, and Carter was one of the people who was, pushing this line. They came away saying it's not useful to refer to it as genocide.
mm,
Now, one of the reasons that it wasn't useful to refer to it as genocide is because if you did define it as genocide, you'd have to do something about it. So this was a way of basically giving a pass to these genocidal maniacs who were coming from northern Sudan down into the south and into the west and attacking blacks, whether they were Muslim or Christian or animist, and literally doing the kinds of things to them that Hamas did on October 7th. So on the one hand, that genocide was not useful, but all of a sudden, accusing Israel of apartheid is useful.
Mm,
And so, in that sense, I think Jimmy Carter, unfortunately, was a sort of victim of, in advance of what has become, I would call it a sort of global plague at this point, of this sort of red green alliance in which the left sides with the jihadis against the democracies.
mm. Yeah, it is so strange. It does seem pathological. It's just a bizarre thing that you constantly see. I'm sort of
And
dan
by the way, Carter met with Hamas, approved of Hamas,
right, right. Yeah.
and he, he's the one who basically made it possible for Khomeini to take over in Iran, and then
Mm.
Khomeini turned around and bit him. But his record of sort of whitewashing Islamic extremism is extremely disturbing.
You have people I'm dancing around a little bit because I will say
Mhm.
if anybody listening to this, if you have listened to Richard Landes on the podcast, the Popperian podcast. That is just such a great conversation. I listened to it like three
That was a
times
lot of
because
fun, right?
yeah, he did a fantastic job. So I'm sort of dancing around. I don't want to have I wanted this to be a compliment to that rather than I don't want you to be
Okay.
able to map anything onto it is the thing
All right.
because it's better to hear different things from somebody. But yeah, this it let me see, where was I going with this? Oh, um, so Judaism comes first, though. You mentioned in the book supersessionism.
Yeah.
What is that exactly, and how does this
Okay.
play?
Right. And this also gets at the issue of why people are so worked up about when Jews behave badly.
Mm,
And that is that supersessionism initially arises within Christianity. The Muslims don't have a doctrine of supersessionism, but they have one that looks just like it. And essentially, what supersessionism argues is that we, the new Israel, have replaced the old Israel, that our values our moral values, our aspirations are so much higher than the Jews that God now favors us and has rejected the Jews. So, the first thing to point out is that this is a profoundly zero sum notion of
mm,
chosen. In other words, in order for me as a Christian to feel chosen, I must believe that God has rejected the Jews. I have to replace them. I can't be chosen also, which would be a positive sum attitude and which would have saved a lot of people a lot of heartbreak.
mm,
So this notion that we are morally superior and that we have replaced the Jews is really built into much of early Christian self-identification. It's what my father would call invidious identity formation,
mm.
which is, I'm big because you're small, and
Right.
so and behind that I'm big because you're small attitude lies precisely this kind of need for news that Jews are bad. In
Mm,
other words, news that Jews are bad bring comfort to supersessionist Christians who believe that they are morally superior to Jews. So all the news that Jews are behaving badly just reinforces their belief that they're superior.
right.
And that's why there's this huge appetite for what I call lethal journalism, which is basically this huge appetite for a story of Jews behaving badly, and the Palestinians are only too happy to supply an endless stream of such accusations.
Right. Do you find too that I've found that with that, lethal journalism can help out people. There are Muslims or Islamists, I would say, that are in like British society and stuff that people like Anjam Chowdhury, which I think that he got
Right,
arrested, I believe, at some point. But then I saw this other guy the other day again on Piers Morgan.
right.
His name is Muhammad Hijab, and
Okay.
he's like a young he was demanding that he be called like he's from Oxford, and he was like, why did you not tell everybody I'm from Oxford? And Piers was like, well, I thought that you okay, if you want people to know that, fine. He's like, yes, I want people to know that. And he's just really like forceful and demanding. But what I find with a lot of these people is they use the freedoms that the West provide against the West, which is
Yeah,
like, well, hey, I have freedom of speech, man, and I'm saying that Sharia law
right.
it should be implemented. Am I not free to say that? And it's like, well, yeah, you're free to say that, but the problem is like that's not going to happen because we live in a free society and that's not freedom. And then you get this like loggerheads or whatever that people get into, and what was the guy? He wrote a book called Clash of Civilizations.
Sam Huntington.
Yeah, Samuel Huntington. Do you find just from what I've said, do you have any reaction to any of that just now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, let me quote something from one of the most brilliant science fiction writers ever, Frank Herbert, who wrote the Dune series.
Right.
And at
Yeah.
one point, he has one of the characters say, when I am weak, I appeal to you to give me freedoms because that is according to your principles. When I am strong, I will take that freedom away because it is according to my principles.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
and that is what the what I call caliphators, the people who want to impose Sharia law globally,
Mm.
are in the process of doing. Now they have a right to say that. We just don't have an obligation to be stupid enough to take them seriously.
Right.
But
Yeah.
we seem to feel compelled. I mean, again, it's this kind of emotional blackmail where if you say, no, wait a minute, that's not the way it works. Um, you're somehow a racist. I
Hmm.
remember at one point, I don't know if you remember this, but around 2004, there was a plan to build a Muslim community center, including a mosque, right near Ground Zero.
Right. I remember
And
this.
yeah, and people were I think justifiably outraged at the thought that because that's exactly what jihadis do is they attack another culture and then they plant the symbols of their sovereignty exactly where they attack. So um, eh, at the time I was teaching at Boston University, and there was an announcement that there was going to be a discussion of this, and it was announced in the school newspaper. And I'm reading the list of people who are going to speak, and it's clear to me that all four speakers are in favor of this mosque or
Mm.
this community, this project. And so I said to the chair of the religion department, I'd be happy to come and speak in opposition to this. And she said, well, it's not really a debate. This is just information,
Mm.
right? Just information, which is all designed, and this is where I think we're looking at the massive failure of information professionals in the 21st century, in which you're just giving information, but you're only giving the information that is going to lead people to take the position that you want them to take, which is in order to prove that we're committed to freedom of religion, we have to give the Muslims what they're asking for. And in
Yeah.
fact, it seems to me when Muslims are asking for power and authority and immunity within Western culture, and they haven't accepted the principles of religious freedom, you're actually undermining religious freedom by acting in this way. And yet, as good virtue signalers, they were all showing their commitment to what they thought was religious freedom.
Yeah, and this brings me to there's a critique of Israel because it's the people have this notion that don't know anything about it. And again, they'll get online and they'll just say things without having any epistemological backing. They'll say something like, "Well, Israel's a theocracy. I mean, it's a Jewish state," and I'm like, "It's actually probably the most secular state that exists. I mean, in a lot of ways."
Certainly in the
And
Middle East.
yeah, oh yeah,
Certainly in
well,
the Middle East.
definitely, definitely, and also it's not, and then you get into this whole it's a colonialist state, and it's this, it's that. I'm like, none of this maps onto reality, and it takes all of 5 minutes to
Right. Right.
unearth this information. And again, the
Yeah.
amount of people want to go into this just completely blind, and
Right.
it's just unbelievable. And again, I guess it does bring back to mind this whole notion of the pattern with a capital P that they that Deutsch has put forth, and it's the only thing you
Yeah.
can think is something ethereal has to be working here. I mean, it's just so.
Right. Right. And I'd like to add something to the pattern, which is what I call the great lethal projection.
Mm.
Because who are the colonialists and the imperialists? It's the Muslims. They're the ones. There's this great comedy routine by an Israeli comedian who says, I was in England and this British woman comes up to me and says, "Are you Israeli?" And he says, "Yes." And she says, "You're a colonialist." And he said, "Lady, you know why most of the world speaks English today? Because of your British imperialism, right? The
Right.
Indians just wake up one morning and say, "Oh, I think I want to learn how to speak English." and
Yeah.
it's like, so here are the Arabs. Arab is spoken in a vast number of countries, and it's because they were conquered by the Arabs from Saudi Arabia. And
Hmm.
so, and the reason why Israel is not acceptable to Arab Muslims and to Muslims in general is precisely because they're still imperialists. They're
Mm.
still people who feel that they have to be on top. And if they're not on top, it's an unbearable humiliation. So the core of the problem is in fact colonialism and imperialism, just happens to be those are the enemies of Israel. And they've managed somehow to convince the world that it's the Jews who are the problem, that it's the Jews who are committing genocide. When, if you go to a site like Palestinian Media Watch or Memory Middle East Memory, MEMRI
Mm.
.org. If you go to these sites, the in some senses, the caliphators are worse than the Nazis in that they're better than they're not. I mean, they're better in the sense that they're more incompetent than the Nazis. But
Right.
but there were no priests and ministers who were calling for the extermination of the Jews from the pulpit. Quite the
Mm.
contrary. Germans tried to cover up the fact that they were exterminating the Jews. Whereas in Palestinian culture, on Palestinian TV, you daily have preachers calling for the extermination of all the Jews, not just the Israelis, all the Jews. Um, so we're talking about, you know, a culture that is openly genocidal, at least in Arabic, but it counts on journalists not to say anything.
Right. Well,
So
yeah.
if you read the New York Times or the LA Times or you listen to NPR, you won't find out about this. You'll hear about Palestinian incitement. But that's
Yeah.
all you'll hear about. You won't hear about the nature of it. You won't hear that, in fact, we are dealing with an exterminationist anti Semitism every bit as virulent as the Nazis. And
Exactly. Yeah.
the only difference between the Nazis and the Palestinians is the Israelis can defend themselves, and the Palestinians are far less competent than the Germans.
So yeah, exactly. As far as the New York Times and stuff goes on this, I subscribe to the New York Times. I read it
Wow.
daily. I read it daily, and I know that it's funny because here's the weird thing though, Richard, about this is like there are people that if you talk to people that are you know, the Free Palestine people, they still think of the New York Times as too
Pro Israel.
pro-Israel. And I'm like, have you read the New York Times? It's
And
like,
the BBC. And the
yeah.
BBC. And I'll
I'm
tell
like,
you why. I'll tell you why. Because the thing about Israel, and I wanted to mention this earlier when you were talking about Israel being the most secular country in the Middle East, it's also the most tolerant.
Right.
Jews, Muslims, Baha'i, you name it, everybody is
Christians.
has Christians has freedom of religion here.
Hmm.
Whereas it doesn't exist anywhere else in the Middle East.
Hmm.
And you have the same phenomenon when it comes to this issue of um, uh, the the need to accuse Israel of the very sins that you're guilty of, and the need of Westerners somehow to support this, to
Hmm.
not mention. Because if you do, you're an Islamophobe, you're a racist, or whatever, which is insane. And the accusation of Islamophobia is so powerful that it's led to what has now been revealed by Elon Musk's initiative of something that some of us have known about for decades, literally decades,
Hmm.
these Muslim rape gangs who groom infidel British girls. And it's happening elsewhere in Europe. And nobody dares talk about it because they don't want to be accused of Islamophobia. So it's like a paralytic.
Mm.
The term paralyzes people and makes it impossible for infidels to defend themselves. Now, we don't have to submit to this. We
Right.
don't have to do this, but somehow huge numbers of people, particularly in the information professions, feel compelled to do it.
Mm. Uh, this I have two more questions 'cause I know I've now come up on our time here, but
Right.
this is and these are unconnected, but one is just what news do you tend to read? I mean, just on a daily basis.
I hate to say it, but I find it very difficult and painful to to read the news,
Right.
and and as a result, mostly I read what my friends send me or my Twitter feed, you know,
Right.
brings. Um, my problem is that because I'm a medievalist and I'm used to sort of digging deep into a given text, I can't just read stuff. If I read it, I have to respond to it. And I would lose my entire life if I were to read a newspaper every day. So
Mm.
I don't. Look, I think that there are certain news sources that are relatively reliable. I read the Times of Israel. I read the Jerusalem Post. I read Quillette.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
I think Barry Weiss Free Press is excellent.
Hmm.
Um, Douglas Murray, of course, writes for her, and so on. So there are good sources. The Guardian, not the Guardian, the Daily Telegraph in England is very good. Um, but it's just so hard to get a grip on. We live in a situation that's never existed before, which is that we live in a condition of information overload.
Yeah.
Up until quite recently, it was also always you couldn't get enough information. Now we
Hmm.
have too much information, we don't know how to process it, and there are going to have to be some sources that come out and do this. And the analogy I make is with the printing press, because if we had all the stuff that was printed, particularly the sort of flyers, the one-page things that were printed and handed out. If we had those from the period of the incunabulas, the 15th century, 99% of it would be totally useless stuff. It would be astrology, it would be apocalyptic
Yeah.
prophecy, it would be vicious invective against the Pope. Well, that's in the 16th century, but in any case, you know, it took a long time for printing to eventually produce a reliable body of uh, of knowledge, and it's going to take that for the internet. Now, I remember back in when I was at BU and I first discovered in the 1990s, I first realized the power of the internet. I said, we should be giving out PhDs to webmasters because they are going to be like the printing houses in Europe in the 16th century. These are the people who make the decisions about what's reliable information and what to put up. And we need a mainstream media. We need reliable people who are capable of filtering out fake news and propaganda and so on. And so far, we haven't been able to do that.
Yeah. Um yeah, it is disheartening every time whenever I read something or if I'm going to put something on a podcast, I always want to cross-reference and
Right,
it's difficult because you have to really go out of your way nowadays to make
right,
sure what you're saying has, bearing in in reality. And oftentimes people will they won't know you'll say something that's like so counter to what they've heard. And you're like, no, no,
right,
no, I've really looked into this. I mean, before I
right,
said this, I made sure I double checked myself. And they were like, oh, that's funny. I thought it was the exact opposite of that. And I'm like, well, that's the
that's the,
problem.
right.
And
And I think your point is well taken, which is that whatever your source of information, when you read an article, especially when it agrees with what you think,
right.
check and see if somebody's critiqued it. I mean,
Mm,
at this point, virtually every article that goes up gets a critique. Now, the critiques aren't always good, but
right.
we have to use our independent intelligence to judge these things, but we certainly owe it to ourselves. If you hear a story on NPR, check it out.
Yeah.
Don't consider it true because you heard it on NPR.
Hmm. Yeah, I listen to on as a daily thing, I tend to listen to as far as Israel goes, I'll listen to the Times of Israel podcast. I feel like that's pretty good. I tried the Haaretz or whatever.
Oh,
That didn't do it for me. And then I did a Jerusalem Post. I've listened to that occasionally, but I tend to do the Times of Israel its take on a daily basis, which is informative. But
the
oh, and
Algeminer is good too.
Algeminer. Okay, yeah, I'll write that down. Algeminer. Um, Last thing, and this is completely unrelated, and this just popped up, and I meant to ask it earlier, but as far as conspiracy theories and stuff, the internet, and this goes along with the internet, conspiracy theories have certainly become a
Yeah,
problem within the past. They've always been a problem, but now it's just
right.
completely out of control. And whenever 9/11 happened, this is the most photographed thing of all time, probably. We all have seen it with our own eyes. Planes hit the building. We know that the people were on it were these 19 hijackers from, the Middle East, and we know the details of this in and out. Uh,
And yeah,
people died. They have family members that are still going, like all of this, and yet this is so disputed, and it's because of 9/11 truthers. And you talk about this in your book, which is so funny. But there's this weird connection between you have people like Alex Jones, who here in the United States is extremely popular, and they listen to Bush did it. It was an inside job, blah blah blah. But it actually does have a reminiscence of like the protocols of the Elders of Zion, even though he's not talking about Jews. It sort of sounds similar to there is a globalist cabal. And what do you make of that? I mean, how do
well,
we combat
yeah. So
this?
there are three elements that contribute to this, and one I became aware of immediately. I was writing about this. In fact, I have an article up at my blog on called "Jews and Conspiracy Theory."
Mm,
Um, and already in the 1990s, it was clear that in the past, conspiracy theories were fairly localized because the people who are spouting them had limited audiences. In other words, within the circle of the people that they could talk to, there were only a limited number of people who were willing to listen to them and buy their stuff.
Mm,
Whereas once you have the internet, it becomes a petri dish for conspiracy theories because now they can appeal to people of like mind all over the West or the world, or whatever language they're speaking in. So that's the first point. The second point is what I became aware of in the course of the 21st century, which is this massive failure of the um, information professions, the professors, the journalists, the talking heads, who were literally across the boards guilty of producing news that was really propaganda, that was designed to get people to think and vote the way the people writing the stuff wanted them to, rather than giving them information and trusting them to make up their own minds.
mm,
So once you have an infected uh, um, information feed, an information sphere in which you don't trust the information you're getting, then it's impossible to really argue against a conspiracy theory.
right.
And then the third thing is, of course, the power of social media and the power of people to literally shout down voices that counter these kinds of things. I mean, to be honest, I think that if Zionists were able to speak at universities, which they're really not,
Hmm.
certainly, by the time I left, nobody was interested in what I had to say. Um, uh, if Zionists were allowed to speak and to present the evidence, I think most people would find the Palestinian argument to be what it is, which is really a pathetic effort to twist their own self-destructive tendencies into accusations against an enemy they can't abide.
Right.
Um, but but that's not the case. The case is that the people who have the evidence against the conspiracy theories are literally driven from the public sphere.
Mm, yeah. Oh man, that's not a good it's not good
It's not
to
a
say
good
the
way to
least.
end this, but let me end it on an up note, which is I think that I didn't vote for Trump, but I do think that Trump's victory was a resounding defeat for the the information professionals who had been systematically lying to us,
Mm,
most obviously about Biden's condition, and also about Kamala Harris. I mean, they basically just covered for them both and tried to push the Democratic platform. And the fact that it was so resoundingly renounced, the fact that now people are starting to attack this notion that Islamophobia is one of the most terrible things that anybody could be accused of. Now we're beginning to find out about what's going on throughout the West in terms of Muslim um, jihadi assaults and caliphate warfare. I think that it's very possible that we will see emerge the beginnings of a kind of sound ecosystem of reliable and relevant information.
mm. I hope so. I think and I'm with you. I didn't vote for Trump. I'm not a Trump's a fan of Trump because of the what we've been talking about. However, I do think that Trump is good for Israel in a lot of ways. And that's the positive of him getting in there. Um and the thing that I see that I'm concerned about, and I've wrote about this on several occasions, is populism has become a huge thing. And as a person that's a devotee of the open society, and I sort of I dive into that quite a bit. And populism to me is this new phenomenon. It's not new. I mean, it's come and go throughout time, but it's very much in vogue right now with a lot of people. And I think that it's creating, I'm sort of nervous as to what's coming over the bend because it's or around the bend. It's creating a fertile ground for demagogues all over the place. And I don't know. It's very hard to see what's going to happen, but hopefully I'm gonna stick with your note, and I say we end on that. But
Uh,
man, Richard, this has been great. If anybody can see this book, if it's not blurring it out, buy this book. I really enjoyed it. I'm at like the last two chapters of it, but this
right.
book dives into a lot of stuff. Um, you
Let me
expose a lot.
point out,
Yeah.
right. Let me point out that at my website, which is Richard Landes.com,
Mm,
if you go to the book, you'll see you can click on footnotes. All the footnotes with I took out the URLs except in extraordinary cases where I didn't think people would be able to find the URLs. But
mm.
most of the URLs are absent from the printed book. But if you go
Oh,
to the website, you'll find the footnotes for each chapter with the URLs.
man, it's great. And yeah, you expose a lot of things in here. As I said, I didn't want to go over the same ground I've heard you cover before. So hopefully this will be a companion piece to other podcasts that you've currently
All right.
or recently been on. But Richard, man, I appreciate it and I hope to talk to you soon. Or,
Good.
I hope to hear from you soon. And you keep doing what
All
you
right.
do.
Thank you.
All right, man.
Thank you
Later.
for this opportunity.
You too. All right, later, man.